Hi, friends. Welcome to Lawyer Up. I'm your host, John Ting. Our guest today has extensive history in the North Texas real estate market. As soon as he's had a driver license, he's been delivering keys to tenants, supervising contractors, and delivering notarized closing documents for a variety of rental properties. Today, our guests focus on all aspects of transactional real estate and corporate law. Outside the office, Ron and his wife, Bethany, have a beautiful daughter named Violet. They live in East Dallas and enjoy being able to walk to all their favorite spots. He's also an avid motorsports fan and can be found on the racetrack with his Honda S2000. He actually has a YouTube channel about that. He graduated from Cornell University with a BA in philosophy and economics and obtained his JD from University of Miami. He's licensed in 2 states, Florida and Texas. He's also president of the North Texas Collin County Taiwanese Junior Chamber of Commerce. Friends, if you're new to our channel, please hit subscribe down below. Smash the like button and leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you. Without further ado, let's meet Ron. Hi, welcome to Lawyer Up, Ron.
Hi, John. Great to be here.
Well, for those in the audience that don't know Ron, he has his own practice with several attorneys working through him, and he practices real estate and corporate law. And so, Ron, we asked you to come on to the show today because, obviously you're with your legal experience with real estate, and also representing investors as well. Recently, about early August, the CDC had issued an order for an eviction moratorium. Can you, from what you've been able to read, can you explain what you understand about it?
Yeah, absolutely. So this order just came out a few weeks ago. It's a relatively short proclamation, but it is very detailed and definition heavy, which as lawyers, we like to see lots of definition, clarification in terms of who this applies to, what are the exceptions, and what does it mean at the end of the day for a landlord who's trying to evict a residential tenant. And in my review, and again, talking to other lawyers, this is a very interesting attempt by the federal government on a very broad sweeping platform to try to regulate something like landlord-tenant law, which is otherwise administered at the very local, the smallest court level, the JP court, Justice of the Peace. And so, besides kind of the bigger constitutional and separation of powers issues, you just have a pure logistics question of how do all of these individual courts apply a federal mandate or moratorium on something that their local municipality has exclusive jurisdiction over? And that's really the question is, yes, the law might be up here, but how is your local JP going to enforce it way over here? There's going to be zero consistency. That's the one thing I'll guarantee you is zero consistency from city to city, from state to state, even I would argue from the same judge to the next judge, because they're going to have a slightly different case. So
Right, even within the same jurisdiction, they could have judges could have different
So
opinion.
like counties, JP courts within the county.
Yeah, that would be interesting because we all know Justice of the Peace courts. I don't know if every state has something like that. I'm sure they do, but they handle these eviction cases, but they don't normally have to read a federal order or mandate, right?
Right. This is definitely unprecedented. We saw a little bit of precedent this year with, the CARES and the federally backed program, if you have a mortgage backed by them. But that was only approximately 28% or 30% of all of the residential tenants. So it didn't cover a majority of tenants. Now we're looking at a moratorium that theoretically covers 100%. And then the duty applies to the landlord to say 100% of landlords now have this duty to affirmatively disprove a tenant's affirmation that they would qualify for protection under this moratorium before they can get an eviction order or maybe a writ.
Right. So what you're talking about is I know some legal aids and other private attorneys have shared this information. I think they call it some kind of certificate, like an exhibit,
Declaration.
right?
Yeah, there's a federal form that they had included. It's a declaration of tenant. Says, under penalty of perjury, civil and criminal penalties, I affirm that everything, and it's a pretty exhaustive laundry list of of affirmative representations by the tenant that, objectively may turn out to be true or may not be true at all.
Yeah, so it seems like this will put management companies, whoever's reviewing these documents, at a burden for them, but also in a strange predicament because aside from illegal issues, no one wants to kick someone out, but it's a significant amount of time, and I could see some issues where some tenants may think this is an opportunity to not pay rent, even if they have the funds.
Right, absolutely. You know, there's, I think, a common misconception that all landlords are these wealthy, massive multi-state corporations with plenty of money and excess reserves. But the reality is, a lot of landlords are W-2 workers. They're people that have their primary residence, they've saved up money, and then they purchase one single rental home. And they may have a mortgage on that, and they struggle to make ends meet with Corona, even as a landlord. And so I think there's a misconception that all landlords are extremely wealthy with deep pockets, because additional bureaucratic layers and protections, I'll give you that. This does protect tenants, and it makes landlords less inclined to try to evict someone, but it adds a layer of complexity and unknowns to these small landlords who then don't have the economies of scale, like having hundreds or thousands of units to spread the costs out, to hire an attorney, to figure out this, because they don't want to get in trouble with the law either. Usually they're just trying to get paid and have an occupied property for their tenant. But ultimately that's who the burden falls on the worst, because the big apartments, the apartment complexes, they're going to be fine. They're going to talk to their lawyer. They're going to charge them. They're going to figure out how to move forward. It's the people that own one or two rental units that are, maybe they're impacted by COVID as well with their income, but they're small unit owners.
Right. And I was just reading here that this order even includes really all type of tenants. I don't know if you read this bit about the shared housing.
Yeah.
But it says not limited to just friends and family, including transitional housing. So yeah, this is pretty broad.
Yeah. And
Which,
again,
in general, it's good for the people, but obviously some consequences.
yeah, everything has to be a balance. I think that more often than not, I represent investors and landlords who are trying to provide the housing, and they're asking me for guidance on how to, get the property vacant so that a hard-paying, hardworking tenant can get into the property. And so that's a big difference between this evil landlord saying, I want to evict. Well, a lot of my clients, they don't want to evict. They would rather have a paying tenant, and even working out some type of reduced rent or having a forbearance or catch up. All of my clients would rather have that type of agreement worked out than going through the cost or the difficulty of an eviction. So that's definitely something to be conscious of. But again, these are protections. Like it or dislike it, it is what is in effect now. It does produce ambiguity. It does produce some uncertainty, and that has costs for the rental market, both landlords and tenants. So
now of course, this informational video, there's no attorney-client, confidentiality here or relationship. But Ron, can you share some kind of like notes, I suppose you can call it, as opposed to legal advice that people should be aware of?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I have clients already now. They're contacting me, asking me, what should we do? They've already been kind of in a pause mode, I think, since COVID hit. And again, a lot of my clients, they have properties based in Texas, right? And so Texas has not been as hard hit with, I would say, an economic depression or people losing their jobs. So luckily their collections have still so far been late, but they're still collecting. So they have the choice to evict, but they're choosing not to. And I think in the light of this, I'm saying this is just one more roadblock. Keep tabs, stay in contact with your tenants. And again, communication. If there's a potential tenant and you're figuring out how to use this, communicate with your landlord. I cannot stress that as advice enough. the landlord is willing to do a lot to bend over backwards to make it work with you. But you got to communicate. You got to let them know what the situation is. If you have an offer letter, if you have expectation of your work, whatever your situation may be, please communicate with the landlord, the property manager, whoever that is. Because when they don't hear anything, that's when they have to make uninformed decisions, and they say, well, this guy hasn't talked to me in 2 months. His rent is late, or he's paid 50%. We're going to just get rid of him because he doesn't communicate, and we don't know what's going on.
Right, because this moratorium or order from the CDC is not saying don't pay rent. It's just the landlords can't evict you.
That's right.
Because as soon as this order is done, all landlords are going to be, I mean, good amount of landlords are going to be ready.
That's right. Absolutely. And so that's what people, and even throughout the peak of COVID, it was never a ban on filing or, serving notices. Maybe you had some extra delays, but it was really just the orders and writs. You weren't getting writs issued, which is that secondary stage where the sheriff goes forcibly to the house if they need to remove. That's the only piece. But people were able to start the paperwork and get everything filed, and then they just stop right here on the edge.
I see. So it's like a holding pattern in the court system.
Exactly. That's a great analogy. Yeah. So people were allowed to take off and they could circle the airport. They just weren't allowed to land. And there's a lot of paperwork. There's a lot of cases circling the airport. And as soon as they're allowed to land, it's going to come down pretty hard.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, good point. Well, I know it's still early in this processing of this order, but have you thought of any long-term effects of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely going to have a chilling effect. You're going to see people screening tenants a lot more carefully. They're going to be aware that even if their state is quote pro landlord, Texas kind of has that reputation. Certain counties not included, but in general, the state is pro landlord. You're gonna hesitate a little bit more. And if you have a marginal tenant, you're not gonna want to take the risk that you may have to evict them, because eviction is going or has become so difficult, and there's a threat or a risk of even more difficult eviction in the future. People are not going to take that risk. And so there's going to be a shift to where it's going to benefit the A plus, stellar credit tenants. They're going to see reduction in rent. And the people who are marginal, that maybe have a one prior eviction a couple years ago, but otherwise have a good job, those people who normally should be able to get housing may not be able to get housing, or they might have to pay a higher deposit. And it's really unfortunate. Those are probably good tenants and people that you want to take a risk for, but they're going to be unable. So
Right. Well, Ron, I've heard of this story, the similar fact pattern for those that normally would be able to rent, but but can't because their current job maybe, or they can't show a certain pay stub high enough, or they don't have a job right now, especially because of COVID.
right.
But I've heard of that like mostly in the LA area where it's very dense.
Yeah, I mean, I have a fair number of investors that are from California that are taking their proceeds out of California because of those eviction rules. California is its own island, but that is a problem in places like California. There's a lot of tenant protections. There's a lot of rent increases. And if people don't qualify, you would rather not be in an uncomfortable position having to choose between tenants. You would rather put your money in a jurisdiction that kind of gives the landlord more freedom to pick and choose who they want as a tenant in their building. That's absolutely true, and I think we're seeing a transfer of those investor assets.
Well, I've also heard similar sentiment about New York, or at least New York City.
Yeah. New York's passed, the increase in rent control. They've taken a lot of steps to protect the tenants at the expense, again, of these smaller landlords that don't have the economies of scale of 500 units, 400 units. They can afford to pay an attorney, get advice. They can figure out how they want to implement this policy. They can adjust, and they can spend the time to do that. Who it hurts the most is the small landlords who rent out a single apartment and they also work another job. They can't spend $5,000 on an attorney to figure out how they're going to move forward. they usually will just put that property on the market and they'll just list it. And so that further reduces the rental supply because smaller landlords are not willing to take that risk.
Right. That's yeah, that's something that most people don't think about. The
But I have a
smaller
solution.
investor.
It's I have a solution for it.
Okay, what do you got?
So again, I'm a real estate investor myself. So I own and we've rented a lot of properties throughout the years. I think that the answer has to come from increased density. And it's something that people debate a lot, but if the prior economic market has producing people, you're making 40, 50,000 a year, you rent a one bedroom by yourself for 1,200, that's a good situation.
Mhm.
With the increase in rents, with the risk of COVID and that sort of thing, people are going to have to double up. And so the better solution is probably finding a roommate. Downsizing where people used to have a two bedroom and then they're going to move into a one bedroom, or they get a roommate in a two bedroom, or if they're in a one bedroom, they move to a studio. Whatever increases the density and decreases the risk for the landlord, right? Because now you've got, say, two people on the hook for the same 1,200 lease, um, and decreases the personal amount that each person is due in half. And they may have the same job or reduced hours, but they can, they don't get a 50% reduction in pay. They lose 20% or 10%. They're able to cover the rent still. That is the solution. And the sooner that we can figure out what that balance is going to be, people are going to be happier. People are going to be less stressed. People are not going to be worrying about covering rent. Landlords aren't going to be worried about the tenants staying for free. And the answer, it's uncomfortable and it's slightly less desirable, but I guarantee I'd much rather have a roommate and not worry about my rent than to maintain my huge loft apartment and be stressing about rent.
Right. Right. No, that's a great solution. I've actually practiced your solution before when I lived in New York for law school. So,
Yep.
yeah,
Yep.
it can get a little cramped, but hey, you got to do what you got to do for the time period.
That's right. So the sooner we can facilitate that, I think everybody will regain, happiness with the status quo because, with the moratorium on evictions, you're not able to produce changes. If you're at physical occupancy at 100% in a building, you can't shift people easily. You need to evict the one bedroom guy and then make that available, and then two other people from a two bedroom can move into that one. And you need to have some of this shifting around to allow that to happen. And
Right.
that'll be the new status is a 500 unit building used to hold 600 people. Now it might hold 750, something like that. But
Well, I can't recall exactly, but I think some local jurisdiction in New York City area may have some restrictions on the number of occupants. But notwithstanding that, hopefully time will change and they'll allow some exceptions.
right. I'm more targeting right now is the very clearly currently allowed occupancies.
For
So
sure.
in a two bedroom, you are certainly allowed two unrelated people, single people to live in. And I'll tell you, there's a lot of people now that are single and they have a two bedroom just because they can afford it. And who doesn't like the extra space? So that's just a easier change besides increasing density and maybe allowing, somebody to convert a den or that sort
Right.
of thing.
Well, now shifting from the investor side, but now in terms of the order, I know you're not necessarily like all about constitutional law in terms of reading every Supreme Court case, right? Because that's really in depth. But from what you understand and your legal experience, you kind of alluded to it earlier, but that it was interesting how the federal government has issued this eviction moratorium through the CDC.
Right.
Any thoughts on that? You can go into politics or you don't have to.
I mean, I think it has to. I think it's inevitable that you have to bring politics up because it is the most logical explanation for why something happened. And if you want to understand why the government is doing something, you have to look at the elected officials who do a lot of acts and behavior purely for political reasons and not necessarily what's in the best interest of the people. They do things in their personal best interest or their office's best interest. So constitutional issues, again, this is a separation of powers. You have the federal government legislating onto the states for something that is strictly within their purview. It's within their scope of jurisdiction, and it's an executive branch acting on the states through an agency. I would see the argument, that you could say it's for health and safety, and that it may be a emergency impetus that could justify some decisive executive order. I don't know how much that holds water. I think the more logical, and let's go for simple, is that President Trump is looking for votes, and there are a lot more tenants than landlords, and passing something to help tenants 2 months before the election, that would make a lot more sense to claim that he is tenant friendly and he wants to help them. This is a temporary moratorium. It doesn't really, change much in terms of their financial. It's not a wealth transfer, right? It's not a wealth transfer away from landlords. It's a temporary time value of money transfer, which is still there, but it's a little bit less. And there's more voters, and there's more voters in swing states that are critical for this 2020 cycle. So that's
for the audience, I want the audience to know that you're not registered as a Democrat.
I am not registered as a Democrat. That is a true statement.
Yeah, I mean, the timing is suspect because, I know you have experience with immigration to some extent, right?
Yeah.
And I'm sure you're familiar with the proclamation back in April, the first one, pretty much suspending all visa entry. So
yeah,
and there's still a legal battle right now on that. But for that proclamation, he really used the same public health concern. So that was April, and now we're in August, first week of August. Now the CDC comes with this eviction moratorium. So it's not like he could have. I mean, they had the CARES Act and all that going on, and that expired end of July.
Yeah.
So if anything, it could have been done in early or around that time,
If this was something 100% motivated by safety and they truly believed that it was a health issue, I agree that the timing, because this, and again, the difference between doing this kind of CDC moratorium, it's very fast, relative to passing legislation through both houses of Congress and getting it signed. That's a long process. So it's expiring at the end of July. You could prep this and have this out in just a couple of days in August, as opposed to waiting till now. But I will play, again, devil's advocate for our president. The Democratic Party and a lot of other important people have continually stressed the scope and the severity of the pandemic, even through today. So I think I saw an ad today for Joe Biden and Kamala wearing the mask. And so he's kind of taking, it's very much like a judo move, all right? It's like taking your opponent's energy, and as much as they bash him for his mishandling and poor handling of the pandemic by saying cases are still going up, this is so bad, Trump has done a terrible job of handling this from a federal level, he says, okay, fine, you're right. It is a very severe pandemic. I'm going to use that energy and every statistic you throw at me and swing it into an executive order that tests the extent of his power. And so for again, devil's advocate, you could say, well, Democrats say that it's a big deal and it's very serious. So how you can't have it both ways.
Yeah, I haven't turned on CNN in a week or so. So I don't know if they've been complaining about this also, but we understand the legal situation and might not pass muster if it really went to court.
Yeah, and then how do you advise clients who come to me and say, Ron, I don't believe this is constitutional? And I tell them, yeah, I kind of agree with you. And they say, okay, so we're not going to listen to it. We're going to shove ahead. We're going to find, a JP that agrees with us. And I want to test one of these cases. And the JPs think that too. If they are 100% convinced it's not constitutional, they might just issue the writ. They might just go ahead. Nothing is proven to stop them. The people who are their bosses are,
laws can be violated. It happens every day, right? So we'll see how it goes.
Right. And they might turn out on the right side of history in which there's no harm, no foul if they do that, right? The tenant would have to appeal and have to go through all these costs. Um, in the meantime, the sheriff then has to decide, am I going to enforce this writ, which it gets very complicated when you're asking people to decide whether to uphold the law or their job, do their job, yes or no. And you might be able to find enough people in that chain who will say, I think this is unconstitutional, we're moving forward. um, we think it falls under an exception, the crime exception or damage to property. That's, to me, that's a big loophole, for to get
Right.
around it. Is you can say, well, no, JP, Your Honor, we think there's a high risk of damage to property. We need to move forward with this eviction. And it's not even bodily harm. It's saying the risk of eviction, it outweighs the risk of property damage. And you're going to get
Right.
JPs that agree with that. If you have text messages, you have a lot of threats, you have, you know,
Well, hey,
yeah,
these days people just love messaging on Facebook. So I'm sure text is, people are just, high emotion, especially
yeah.
during the pandemic.
Yeah. Well, and you had that story. There was a woman. I can't remember what state she was in, but she, I think it was in Houston. Maybe she got evicted, and then
Mm.
she burned down the apartment. I mean,
Oh, shoot, I missed that.
okay, I'll send you the link. But it was like a low rise, small apartment building, 20 or 30 units. She went to JP court. She lost. She was evicted, and then she came back and was telling all the neighbors she's going to burn the place down, and she did. She started a fire in her own apartment, and thankfully nobody was killed, but a dog was killed. They evacuated it, and a dog was killed. Significant property damage, incredible risk, to the people who live there, her neighbors. And that's the kind of situation, again, that I would say is very real and is very potential threat. That if I was a JP, I would say, yeah, this person is threatening to burn down the building. We're going to evict them. We're going to command the sheriff to go serve this.
Well, I can say that that is a tip for all our clients who are investors to buy some insurance, property insurance,
Well,
high
criminal acts
value,
sometimes are excluded. I want to, yeah.
high value. Okay. Well, anything else you like to share about? Well, I did have a question about something similar. One of the, I think it was about last month, he had Trump, is who I'm talking about, of course.
You're
He
on a
had
first name
issued
basis.
several other executive orders all in that same day, but one of them was about, I believe it was rent moratorium. So not eviction moratorium, but rent moratorium. But I know a lot of people are talking about, well, is that even possible also? Have you had
Yeah,
a chance to
I
look at
mean,
that?
that to me is too far. That's a bridge too far in terms of takings. You really can't dictate that direct, financial or money issue. It's essentially just a taking. It's changing contracts as well, and there's really no basis at all to modify a private contract between two parties. And instead, the tools really are, I think, Congress to do the CARES Act and provide stimulus checks that the tenants then are responsible for paying or not paying their rent.
Yeah.
That's the tool that the federal government should use, not trying to impose on the otherwise valid private party contractual agreements.
So I'll play devil's advocate as well. And, Trump seems like he's trying, right?
Trying what? Trying to do what?
Trying
What?
to help people in general
Yeah.
by, doing the eviction moratorium or the rent moratorium, even though it I mean, I don't know if you need a legal background to understand it, but obviously there's some nuances. But, there's a quick headline saying eviction, moratorium, whatnot. People generally inherently are going to like that, right? But why isn't Congress doing anything? It just seems, I know that's a rhetorical question, but
Yeah.
it just seems that Congress hasn't acted on several things, not just about this whole pandemic, really, recently.
Yeah, I mean, I again, I try not to follow politics in the sense that it's an unproductive part of my day. But yeah, you see the House wanting a lot put into the bill and saying something is not better than nothing. They really draw the line in the sand and saying we need 5 billion instead of the Senate coming back and saying we'll give you 3 billion, right? And that's the House Democrats. And again, I'm not going to opine whether it's true or not, but that's what they're saying.
Yeah.
Is that no, it's so hard to pass a bill through both houses and get it signed. We need to make sure that it's 5 or 4 and not 3. So I think that that's the answer to your question, is just Congress is dysfunctional. The two houses are so far apart in terms of their goals, and
Yeah, it seems they want to both sides of Congress want to allocate to different sources and different amounts.
yeah.
So yeah, we'll
They
see
don't
how
want
it
to help
goes.
the voter. They don't want to help the people. At the end of the day, they want to appear like they're helping the people, but they don't. They don't want to help. I mean, they could. It's certainly within their power to be, and it's because especially in the House, right? I don't think there is the same amount of extreme disdain for any member of the Senate from any Democrat or Republican in the House, right? They have a much higher level of mutual respect. It seems like they should be able to get more stuff through. Maybe McConnell. I hear people have really choice words for McConnell, and I'm like, I don't know. He's just a guy.
We'll see how that goes this week. Well, they're supposed to be returning to today's Tuesday.
Yeah.
They should be returning to Congress today.
Yeah. So
We'll
again,
see.
I think it would benefit both houses, House and Senate, to be passing bills and saying like, let's put him on the president's desk. Let's make him choose. Let's put him in the position to decide which bill do you want to pass, what direction do you want to go. But instead, they're not even agreeing on that. So
Right, which I
they
thought was
they make
surprising.
Trump's jobs easier, right? That's what kills me. They make his job easy. They don't put him on the spot and saying, look, we're in harmony. Like we both agree we need to help our voters. President Trump, you decide. It's They just don't even pass anything.
Yeah, that's what I was hoping for too, Ron. But yeah, we're just at a loss right now.
I mean, there's so many things
Yeah,
that
I'm
could
sure
be.
there's a lot of things that we don't know in the
Yeah.
background.
And if you're cynical, it's because they're evaluating a lot more internal motivations. And simplest explanation is probably true. And if you look at it, they're acting for their own interest, I think. And their best interest to get reelected is not to, they don't need to pass anything to get reelected. They just need to seem like to their voters, to their tiny district or their state, that they're doing the best for those people. Screw the rest of the country. I'll get reelected as long as I convince my people that I'm doing a good job. So
Right, right. Well, Ron, we'll see how it goes November 3rd. I mean, and I know the last part of this conversation is about the overreach of executive order, right? But
yeah,
and that goes with any president. So I don't want anyone in the audience to think like we're just specifically bashing, or I mean not bash, but like be critical of this president.
yeah.
But Ron and I have talked about President Obama and his overreach as well. So
He
this goes
really
along
set a
with
bad precedent. I mean, I think Obama was just in terms of sheer number, and you can talk about the scope and you can argue about the frequency and application, but just in terms of sheer number, he was really the first that came up with just a high number. And even if they were small and precise, the number was up there, and it was tough. He had some opportunities with both houses, and he still felt the need to do a lot of what he did. And it's unfortunate. It just sets a bad precedent because one election away and you have Trump and he's got the same pen.
right, right. That's true. Well, Ron, do you have any lasting information you'd like to share for the audience?
Well, my advice to really just both investors and landlords or tenants, whoever's listening, take the time to just read this, understand, and just try to communicate. You don't need to hire a lawyer. I think right off the bat. But if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me, reach out to John. There are people that have policies and guidance for your local county, but just communicate. It makes our job, I don't say easier. I don't know if it makes our job easier, but try to communicate with both sides. And that goes, don't ignore, don't delay. Both sides need to have communication, because this is an ever-changing area of law, and it has real impacts. These are people who are the tenants, and we just ask that you take both sides into account.
Absolutely, Ron. Well, Ron, we're going to add your information below so people know how to contact you, along with your website. We really appreciate your time.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, John.
Friends, if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe down below. Smash the like button. Whether you're a landlord or tenant, please let us know if this CDC order has affected you in some way. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, have a great week.